I suppose first thing I would say is just that I agree with a lot of that. I think that's an incredibly rich and powerful and productive analysis. I just want to perhaps very briefly reiterate a couple of those points and add a couple more examples, but also maybe try and look for a way out of some of the quandaries that I think Timothy Clark rightly identifies. Because I would argue that his perspective here, while it is on one level enriched by his experience in deconstruction, his research in continental philosophy, I would also argue that deconstruction is a logic of entrapment, and whilst the quandaries and the difficulties that he's identified are undoubtedly real, it doesn't mean that there aren't any ways out of them, and I think that I can hopefully give some examples of that. So one of the arguments that he puts forward is, perhaps the central argument, is the one about scale and the multiplicity of scale and the way and the various ways in which scales matter. A mid-20th century biologist, whose name escaped me, pointed this out in relation to biological organisms. It matters a great deal with biological organisms. He pointed out that if you drop a mouse and a human and a horse down a mine shaft, the mouse will bounce, the human will be crushed under their own weight and flash. So it matters very much to organisms the sort of level at which they perceive and experience things. And it's obviously the case that literature and culture are overwhelmingly orientated, traditionally orientated, towards the kind of what you might call, from our perspective, the middle level, the level of individual humans and, as he pointed out, kind of the second level, immediate forms of human social organisation, countries, nations, ethnicities, identities, and their histories, and so forth. So overwhelmingly, the humanities has concerned itself with those. Now, I think it's also the case that part of one of the, some of the things we've been hearing at this conference and we're hearing increasingly at a lot of other eco-criticism conferences, is how artists and critics and writers and painters are actually very deliberately trying to engage with other scales. He didn't mention this in his talk, but of course Ursula Heisser's sense of place and sense of planet has attempted to give some examples, not unproblematic ones, of the ways in which writers have attempted to encompass scales other than that kind of what I would call that middle scale. Incidentally, if you're interested in following this up further, a much more positive account of how we can come to terms with problems of scale is in Mitchell Tomashow's book, Bringing the Biosphere Home. Mitchell Tomashow's orientation is a pedagogical one. He's interested in, not so much the theoretical question, but what can we do in the classroom with students to help them address and overcome and come to terms with these problems of scale. He acknowledges the difficulties, but I think he shows a lot of ways out of them. Having said that, I also thought one of the things I really admired about Timothy Clark's paper was the way in which his reading of the Raymond Carver story also attempted to show a kind of positive way out of this. It's a positive way out pedagogically, because one of the things that one of the important differences actually between Clark's approach here and what you've tended to find in a lot of eco-critical treatments of climate change in recent years by Richard Kerridge or by Ursula Heisser is that we've tended really to focus on text. To what extent can authors and texts accommodate multiple scales? I think what's really interesting about what Clark is doing here is that he's looking at it as also a problem of reading and teaching. He's putting forward the idea that you don't have to just find examples of novels which accommodate multiple texts. You can actually, multiple scales. You can actually read a lot of texts in terms of the ways in which they accommodate or don't accommodate multiple scales. So I think that's a really progressive development. One response you might have to that, though, he's right, of course, that what Timothy Morton calls the ecological thought, what that means to a huge extent, and it goes well beyond climate change, in fact, is that our kind of middle scale, our human organismic scale, is constantly being confounded both by much larger and by much smaller scales. So the one he's predominantly talking about is climate change, but of course it's also the case that in pollution narratives, in anxieties about biological pollution, or germ warfare or what have you, all of these things are actually microscopic ways in which human being and human perceptions are undermined, confounded, complicated by microscopic and even molecular levels of perception. The difference between one of the differences between us and the mouse and the horse is that whilst we are physically embodied at a certain level, the prosthesis, the perceptual prosthesis of scientific instruments actually enormously extends the range of our perception. That, of course, also has now rebounded on us in the form of all kinds of ethical anxieties. So now the more we see, the more we fear, which I think is something that both Morton and Clark have identified in their work. But I just want to suggest some ways in which we might look for ways out of this logic of entrapment. And I think that the difficulty with Clark's argument comes from the way in which, rather typically I think for deconstruction, it takes certain categories as much more rigidly self-sufficient than they might in fact be, and then worries about how rigidly self-sufficient they appear to be, when in fact they've been constructed in that way in the first place. Let's take this idea of scale and think about it in relation to academic disciplines. One way of looking at the study of climate change is to think that actually what different disciplines do is operate on different characteristic scales. And he alluded to this, I think, at the end when he talked about how in physics, for example, an account of physical laws is considered more useful, have more kind of leverage, more torque on the real world, the more it irons out differences in favour of persuasive overall laws, generalities. But actually, it seems to me that intellectual progress in this world of scholarship actually functions simultaneously in multiple disciplines. And if he talked about disciplines as logics of containment, and he's absolutely right, of course, that working across disciplines is incredibly difficult. It's difficult in institutional terms, it's difficult in personal terms, but it's not impossible. And climate change is precisely the sort of wicked problem that can perhaps entice us into interdisciplinary collaborations, because it's actually at that level that these multiple scales actually can be accommodated. Because microbiology has its characteristic level of explanation. As he pointed out, literary criticism has its characteristic level of explanation. Climatology has its characteristic level of explanation. And those are only demoralizingly distinct if we consider that interdisciplinarity is simply impossible. Whereas I would argue that in all sorts of areas of modern intellectual inquiry, there are signs, admittedly rather limited ones, but there are signs that these kind of cross-disciplinary problems are eliciting cross-disciplinary responses. So I wouldn't share his defeatism, actually, I think, in relation to that disciplinary problem. He also said quite early on that he also cited arguments to the effect that the complexity of contemporary society functions or creates a certain type of fragility. That when you go beyond, if you like, from a hunter-gatherer society to a city-state to global multinational globalization, in short, then you are increasingly fragile. Now, of course, this is kind of beyond our disciplinary discussion, but many economists would argue the exact opposite. That what globalization, what increasing scales of economic cooperation, and of course, let's not forget intellectual cooperation, facilitated by global communications, that this increasing scale actually generates an extraordinary kind of resilience. Now, while he's right, of course, that resilience has been bought at on this kind of one-time bonanza of fossil fuels. So unless this globalized, integrated economy can find a way beyond that one-time bonanza of fossil fuels, he's absolutely right. There is no hope whatsoever. But it's not as if there isn't a lot of work going on in lots of different parts of the world both scientifically and by industrialists, to try and do precisely that. So I think again there is a kind of defeatism about that. That actually you might well argue that it's precisely small-scale societies that are vulnerable to environmental change, rather than very large-scale societies. And finally, I think I would take issue with his idea that the problem that ethics traditionally reckons with non-cumulative behaviour. I think this is actually a really, really important insight. He's absolutely right to say that that traditional philosophical ethics has treated moral decisions as if they just happen one at a time to individuals and they just could be evaluated on that sort of basis. But the problem here, as he observes, is that you don't just decide to fill the kettle once, you decide to have a kettle and use it. You don't just decide every time you go out in your car, you decide, or society to some extent decides for you, that you need a car and you're going to use it sometime or another. And he's also right to say that there is a kind of bizarre and sometimes comical derangement of scale between, the apocalyptic predictions, for example, of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and the utterly trivializing examples of individual actions you can take to mitigate it at the end. I mean, there's just this kind of demented disparity, and I think he's absolutely right about that. But whilst ethics may not has not come to terms with actions of cumulative morality, and I thought it was brilliant analysis, by the way, that what we suffer from is a cumulative insignificance. As well as a difficulty of perception, there's a cumulative insignificance. Each thing seems pathetically unimportant, and yet on the very, very large scale of now nearly 7 billion people, that those acquire extraordinary significance. But a couple of observations about that. One is that actually those cumulatively significant actions really do matter primarily at the organismic or the middle level. So climate change is going to be catastrophic, or may well be catastrophic, for some humans, for some or even many other animals at our scale. On a microbiological level, it doesn't exist. And in fact, on a global climatological level, it effectively doesn't exist, in the sense that the planet has numerous different climatic states, and none of them seem to be favoured in any meaningful sense over any others. So actually, you can reduce the ethical scale as well as expanding it. But also, just as the possibility for multidisciplinary study accommodates multiple scales, so also I would argue that culture is, to some extent, cumulative. Again, one of the things that I think we've all in eco-criticism been excessively concerned with is the idea that there might be, the one-shot response to climate change. So this, hence the kind of the hype and then the disappointment of Ian McEwan's novel Solar. So it was as if, and I admit to having felt this way actually, both as an Ian McEwan scholar and as an eco-critic, I kind of felt like, at last, this will be the one. He's a great novelist. He's a very well-respected novelist. He's going to write about climate change. This will be the tipping point. This will be the crucial moment. Or you get things like George Monbiot's incredible claim that McCarthy's novel The Road was the most important novel of the century, even though it doesn't actually mention climate change. But actually, we don't need one. We don't need one novel. We don't need the one film that will change everybody's minds. Actually, that's a crazy model of social change and ethical and political change. Actually, what we need is a lot of multiple genres, none of which is ever going to identify the one right. There's no generic solution to climate change. There's no end point to this. There is only a multiplicity, a multiplying of responsive cultural forms in all kinds of areas, scientific, in the humanities, and actually that's exactly what's happening. Environmental historians are working on climate change, artists are working on climate change, engineers are working on climate change. There are responses going on in all kinds of areas of culture, and those are, unlike the isolated acts of traditional ethics, those are, to a very large degree, cumulative. And so I just wanted to take issue finally with a comment he made just at the end. And he said, whether or not, despite how insignificant it is, filling up your kettle or not filling up your kettle is still more important than what your political beliefs are. And I think this kind of exemplifies that, the kind of fatalism to which Clarke's view commits him. Because whilst of course it's true that there are these kind of senses of disproportion, it is also itself a brutally reductive view of human agency. I mean, you can't help recalling, actually, strangely, you could say that perhaps Milan Kundera was one of the first people to notice this kind of derangement of scale, though not in an environmental sense. He pointed out that the more people there are, the lighter our being is. You know, we have that kind of metaphor of the heaviness of being, but the more people there are, the lighter we are. And actually, it's not heaviness of being now that assails us, but lightness of being. And of course, that's true. And lightness of political being is also a fundamental problem that I think he's right to identify. But to imagine that a single act of filling your kettle is of more significance than a sustained political attitude seems to me absolutely absurd. Having said that, though, I would also really applaud him for what I think is a quite unusual and quite intellectually risky commitment to addressing the issue of population. It's one that very often in the humanities, and I've had this experience at conferences of literally being shouted at and shouted down for mentioning the question of population, but actually what he's talking about, I think crucially, is not predominantly developing world population. He's talking about us. He's talking about our reproductive decisions, because each one of those is multiplied by the wealth that the child will come into as a member of a developing world country. And I think he's absolutely right to draw attention to that, although he hasn't gone the extra step and asked what kind of literary forms might correspond to this kind of skepticism or anxiety, or at least critical ethical analysis of developing world reproduction. So here's just a suggestion. For anybody that's looking for an eco-critical research project, maybe you should go looking for paedophobic literature. Thank you.